All right, welcome everybody. Glad you're here again today. Today we're going to be starting on the skeletal system. So we're going to be covering quite a breadth of things today, and we're going to continue this into next week. So we're actually covering this over 2 weeks. So we have Learning Plan 6 over 2 weeks. So if you look at your notes, we have information that's coming from Chapter 6. And if we go to page 6 in your notes, we go to Chapter 7. And then we continue on to Chapter 8. And that should do it. So we're actually pulling stuff from about 3 different chapters. So we're going to get through Chapter 6 today. We're going to get into Chapter 7. And then we're going to pick up where we left off next week, Chapter 7, and then go into Chapter 8. So there's a lot of information that we covered here in this class. A lot of this is memorization. So it's expected that you should, by the time you're done with this learning plan, know all the bones of the body. And that sounds like an intimidating task, maybe, but it's not really that intimidating because, as we're going to see as we start going through the bones, the toughest part, and where you probably will end up spending most of your time, is going to be on the bones of the skull, bones of the wrist, and the bones of the ankle, because those are the most numerous and the most diverse bones. But remember that you have 2 wrists, you have 2 ankles, so once you know one side, you know the other, right? So that takes care of it pretty quickly. And then the bones of the skull, some of them are paired bones, some of them are single bones, but we'll go through those. And then the other thing to remember is that some of these bones are also very generic in their name. So they don't have specific names. So for example, because you have 2 sides of your body, you have 12 ribs for each side of your body. So how many bones is that? 12 plus 12?
24.
24. They're just called ribs. There's 24 bones. That's over 10% of the bones of the body right there, right? You have 7 cervical vertebrae, you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and then you have 5 lumbar. So 12 plus 5 plus 7, again, that's 24. So between your ribs and your vertebrae, there's 48, almost a quarter of the bones of your body. And then you've got the generic metacarpals in your hand, and then the phalanges. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 metacarpals. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 proximal phalanges. 1, 2, 3, I'm sorry. Yep, 5. Then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 middle phalanges, and then you got 5 distal phalanges per hand. And you just call them phalanges. That's a lot right there, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. So 19 generic bones per hand. Double that, and then you got the same number in your feet. Okay? So you're talking 38 plus 38. That what, 76 bones? So 76 bones are just generic, just in your hands and your feet, plus then the 48 I just mentioned, the bones, the vertebrae and ribs. So we're well over halfway. See? So it isn't that intimidating of a task once you know what you're dealing with. So don't worry about learning all those bones. It's bless you again.
Sorry.
No, hey, no problem, no problem. All this talk of learning gets you, I get allergic to learning too, or the thought of that, right? Excuse me, it's that time of the year. All right, so let's jump into it. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the skeleton in general at first, so that you kind of have a lay of the land. We'll start talking about the different types of bones, but we're going to start off beyond just the general information about the skeleton. We're going to start off by looking at skeletal tissue, and this shouldn't be a foreign concept to you because we did talk a little bit about bone tissue, right? We talked about bone being a connective tissue. We're going to talk about how it's built, the different types of bone tissue, and the characteristics of bone tissue. We're going to talk about that. Doesn't that sound exciting? Maybe, I don't know. So let's I don't know if I'd say exciting, right? But let's where'd that go? Of course, the one that I want disappears, right? Let's see if we can get this. Okay, let's try getting you up again. There we go. Okay, that looks good. Like it's going to cooperate. So we're all right. So I'm not going to promise that I'm going to go straight through the notes, but if you find that I'm jumping around and you have a hard time figuring out where I am in the notes, I'm not going to jump around too much, but if you have a hard time figuring out where I am, just raise your hand, let me know, and then we'll get you back on track. Fair enough? Okay, let me just get my pen going. We'll get started. Okay, so looking at the skeleton, actually looking at this picture, we've got quite a few things going on. All right, so when we look at the skeleton, if you'll notice, we have two different colors. We have this darker brownish type of color. This denotes what we call the axial skeleton. This is like the axis of the body. This is the head, the vertebral column or the vertebral column, and then the ribs. So this sort of makes up the axis. So the axial skeleton, again, made up of pretty much the skull, the vertebrae, and the ribs. And then we have the appendages. So the extremities. And you'll notice that the extremities start with some bones that we're going to learn or familiarize ourselves with, what we call the collarbone, commonly called the clavicle. And then we have the shoulder blade in the back, which scapula. That's actually the connecting point. Actually, there's one connecting point right here. This is the connecting point that connects the axial skeleton on the upper extremity to the appendicular skeleton. And that's called the sternoclavicular joint, or the SC joint. It's where the sternum and the clavicle come together, but we'll get back to that. So that's where it connects, and then we also have here the connection between the lower extremities and the axial skeleton, which is what we call the sacroiliac joint or sacroiliac joint, depending. Some people say sacrum, some people say sacrum. It's what we generically call the hip bone, the coxal bone here, the ilium meeting up with the sacrum or the sacrum, which is the bottom part of the vertebral column. All right, so those are the connecting points for the appendicular skeleton. What makes it handy when we're learning the bones is that it's paired. So if we know there's a humerus on one side, there's a humerus on the other side, and a radius and an ulna. So we're going to get into all that and just review that. Also on this picture, they're showing you the different types of cartilages. I don't really need to review the cartilages with you because I know we covered the cartilages to quite an extent in the tissues, right? We talked about the three different types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. So we're good to go. That's what we're talking about at the beginning of the notes. There is a section on cartilaginous growth at the beginning of the notes, and I will come back to that when we cover how bones grow, so that way we kind of go together. So I'm just going to make a note here to go through review cartilage. I'm going to just put review cartilage here. To come back to it because it's not a major point, and I don't want to waste your prime learning window on the way cartilage grows, because that's just a minor thing. All right, so let's look at the different types of bones. We can name bones according to their shape. So if you look at this picture here, we've got the long bone. This is that generic bone that we talk about. That's the humerus. That's the bone that the dog digs up in the yard or buries in the yard, right? They show that bone. You know, they show you this generic bone like that. That's a long bone. They call it long bone because obviously it's longer than it is wide. So it's a long, almost a tubular type of bone. We see this primarily in the extremities, an appendicular skeleton. Then we have what's called an irregular bone. The reason why it's called irregular bone is because it doesn't have any set shape. It's an irregular shape. It's what we'll see primarily in like the vertebra, as they give an example here. We'll talk about the vertebra. Then we also have the flat bones. So we'll see flat bones in the skull. We'll see flat bones making up the sternum. And these are bones that are relatively flat. That's why they call it a flat bone. And those bones grow a certain way. We're going to talk about the different way that bones grow. And so the flat bones have a specific type of growth that they undergo. It's kind of like a sandwich of bone, and I'll get back to that later. But those are what we call the flat bones. And then we have things that are called the short bones, and these are primarily found in the wrist and the ankle, making up those bones. So these are the different types of bones according to their shape. It's not a major learning point, but I want to introduce it to you so that way you've got an understanding of what the different types of bones are. We also have some other things that we talk about as far as bone markings. And if you look in your notes at page 2, we're skipping Roman numeral 3 just for a second as I just introduce you to this table here. All right. So on bones, I'm going to pull out a bone here. I'll pull out several bones. Let me just grab my projector here so I can show everybody at the same time. Okay, let me just switch over to a different here. That looks better. So that way when I move one way, it's gonna be consistent. So that way when I move my hand this way, it moves that way. Okay, so I've got the skull here underneath the thing. I'm gonna zoom out a little bit. Brightness here. All here. Better? There we go. Burning. There, can you see the skull now? Probably for all of you in here, that picture is going to work a little bit better. Let me kill the lights. That might help, might not help. No, it doesn't, because now I kill everything. All right. Can you see it a little bit better on that screen? Let me brighten it up a little bit. That looking better? Yeah, it looks pretty good now. You can see it, especially on that bigger screen. And on the front screen, you can see it as well. All right, so we've got the skull. Now, this is an actual real bone skull. These are hard to come by nowadays without paying an arm and a leg, but we've got actually a couple of disarticulated real bone skeletons. So when we look at the skull, the skull is a great example of bone markings. And we see that bone markings come in two different varieties. We have what are called the projections, and we also have what we would call depressions. All right. So, for example, this structure right here, you can see it's an outie. I said, these are outies or innies. Outies. So this is a projection. It comes out of the bone, and these projections are usually attachment points for muscle, because the role of the muscles is to pull on the bones to move. So we will have, for example, muscles that pull on the mandible. We have muscles that will open the mandible, they'll close the mandible. We have, for example, here, this is a projection which we call the zygomatic arch. And this is also an anchoring point for muscles. So wherever you see the outies, the projections, usually their role is to be an anchoring point for muscle. You can even see here that because it's a real bone skeleton, here's a unique feature here. Let me turn it this way. There's this little bump here. This is not an official bony projection, but you can see here that there was a muscle that attached to the bone here. The bone actually grew out to accommodate some sort of muscular attachment here. But you can see that the skull is very rough. It's got all these ridges in here. These are attachment points for muscle. And you can see here, this is something you see on most skulls. I see almost like this M here. So this is what we call the nuchal line. Nuchal means neck. So some of your neck muscles will attach here and allow for the pulling so that you can look up. So you can up. So these are what we call the bony projections. You can see the projection here. There's a projection here. There's projections here and here. These are called the styloid processes. So these are the projections. Now, also in the skull, you're going to see the innies. You're going to see the depressions. You're going to see what we call as the depressions. These are things that are either for example, we call this the it's hard to see it here because the jaw is in here. But if I pull the jaw out, you see how the jaw bone fits in that little groove there, right there. So this groove right here, I'm going to dislocate the jaw for just a second here. This little groove here, for example, is called the mandibular fossa. It's the groove or depression in which the mandible fits. See, it locks in there. This is the temporomandibular joint. This is the mandible. This is the temporal bone. So it's the temporomandibular joint. It's the joint formed between these two bones. So this is an innie, all right? External acoustic meatus. This is the ear hole. This is where the sound goes in so we can actually hear. So you'll see that there are lots of depressions within the skull. Here's another one. This is called the mental foramen. The jaw refers to whenever you refer to the jaw, that's the mental aspect, and this is a foramen, it's a hole. So we can see that we're going to have different names associated with different bone markings. So those are just some examples. You see them also on some of the long bones. So for example, on a long bone, here's this is the tibia, this is the shin bone. Okay, so this is the knee, and then this is the shin bone, and this is the shin, actual shin, the front of the leg, and then this is the ankle. So this is what we would call, let's make sure we get it right here. This is the, going to be a right knee. So this is going to be the medial, what we call the medial malleolus. So if I tell you to reach down and grab your ankle on the inside of the ankle, this is actually the bone that you're touching, the tibia. So anyway, you can see here we've got a really sharp, maybe you can't see it so well in this picture, but you can kind of see that there's this really sharp line that comes down the front. That's even what we call a projection, a line. And you can see here, there's another line, kind of hard to see, but I'll kind of try to catch the light on it. My finger is sliding down a line here. This again is an attachment point for a muscle. So these different projections, like I said, the outies are usually attachment points for muscles. The innies are usually where things are going to fit into, or they're going to be things that things pass through, like blood vessels and nerves and so forth. Right? So let me just go back here and reset my camera. And then we'll go back over to the PowerPoint, so I can show you how that relates to what we're seeing. All right, so looking at this picture now, this is a table. Remember those tables in your book, you should know by now, or I hope you know by now, that the tables are these fantastic references that I always encourage you to use to get concise information. Misplaced my pen. Put it in my pocket. Where I put it? Oh, here it is. All right, so I'm not expecting you by any means. I'm not expecting you by any means to memorize these bone markings. Okay, you're going to see them when you're memorizing your bones, and we're talking about the different aspects of the bone. You're going to see some of these terms like crest and spine and tuberosity and process and facet, condyle and tubercle and line. You're going to see all these things. Trochanter. You're going to see all these terms coming up. Just be aware that these are the outies. These are the bone projections, right? And actually is the first term today, bone marking. some other markings are at the top of this picture here that we're showing, everything above this line here. So a head, facet, condyle, we saw some of these before, ramus. These are all projections. These are projections that help form joints. We'll talk more about joints later, but understand there's a tremendous amount of information. We could spend a long time just talking about the skeleton itself. So we're kind of picking and choosing. We kind of do that for everything. We could talk about the muscles for many, many days and weeks, and the nervous system, but we're just trying to give you an overview and bring it up on the basics. All right, so these are depressions and openings. You can see these are for passage of blood vessels and nerves. So you see things called grooves and fissures and foramen or foramina, notches, meatus, sinuses, and fossa. So these are all names given to the depressions and the openings of the body. So just be aware that these exist. You're going to see the terms. And if you're wondering, you know, if you see like inferior orbital fissure, what's a fissure? Just go back to this bone markings table and look it up. Fissure, it's a narrow slit-like opening. Okay, great. So what we're going to do is we're going to be exposed to them. What we're not going to do is expect you to memorize them. I wouldn't say I have nightmares, but I remember, and this is education beyond the level that you're at. So I mean, so it's not equal. So I don't have these same expectations of you. But I remember having to look at a skull and turning the skull over and looking at the bottom and trying to memorize so I could be able to tell somebody what every single opening at the bottom of the skull was. That was a fun time, let me tell you. I'm not expecting that from you. All right, so what questions do you have on what we've talked about so far? Good? Okay. So what I want to do before we move on is I want to give you the opportunity to just, I don't know, for people who are watching this video, this is not going to be a very beneficial exercise for them, but if you're watching this, you can just, if you're watching this live, you can just sit tight. If you're not watching this live, you can just kind of fast forward a little bit. But what I want to do is I want to just give you an opportunity, we give you 5 minutes to grab some bones out of these boxes and just take a look at the texture of the bones, look at the characteristics and qualities of the bone, feel how heavy or light the bones are. And I want you to also look at the bones in regard to the openings and depressions and so forth. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes, grab a partner or work in a group of 3. The only thing I ask is if you pull from this box right here, then make sure that when you put the bones back, you put them back in this box. And if you pull from this box over here, the blue box, make sure that you put things back in the blue box. So you can kind of look between both of them and see if there's something that's enticing or appealing to you that you wanted to see and look at. We're going to be coming back and looking at them again. I'll put them on the projector. But I want to give you the opportunity to just get your hands on some bones and just kind of play around with them and get an appreciation for the density of the bone, the characteristics and qualities of the bone, and also I want you to check out some of those bone markings and depressions. All right? So I'll give you about 5-ish. If we're still looking at things and still fascinated by it, I'll give you 10 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll talk about something else. All right? Watching, if you're watching live right now, we're just taking a moment to look at some bones here in the room. So we're going to be coming back together with the group in about 5 minutes. So just if you're watching live, just sit tight and we'll be right back with you in just a little bit.
Yeah, but I mean, like, if you think about maybe it's all of us. I mean, is her head really that small?
All right, so what do you think? What are your thoughts, impressions?
You don't think they would be as protective as they are?
They look more brittle
Yeah.
than you would think?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. What else? Yeah, go ahead.
You're looking at one of the long bones in there. I don't know, the holes in there kind of make me.
Yeah, so you saw some characteristics and qualities of the bone that it kind of looked like air pockets in there, right? Kind of like bread dough, you said?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to talk about that in a little bit.
And they kind of.
They were stretched?
Yeah,
What do you
like
mean,
stretched bread dough. Like I don't know.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
the little, almost like stringy,
Yeah.
like little strings and pockets kind of pulled apart, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What else? What else? Did anything surprise you about the bones? I mean, we've talked about how they seem more brittle.
They're really light.
Very light?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think that they're that light.
Yeah, they're extremely light. And like I said, they appear very, and like we said before, they appear very brittle. I mean, if I look at this, which is the
Shoulders.
scapula, which is the shoulder blade, it's probably hard to see unless I zoomed in, but you can even see. If you look, can you see my finger through it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, these are thin. There's not a lot to it. So here's the thing about bones. Number one, well, what you're getting here is bone that has dried out over time. And so just from that, they're gonna be a little bit more brittle because they're not filled with blood like they usually are. Or the bone marrow itself is not in there. So that's gonna add to a little bit of the density of the bone. But you have to also remember here with the scapula, for example, with a lot of these bones, they're covered with big, thick, or it's not necessarily big, thick, but they're covered with muscles. And so, if I ask you to reach around and touch your shoulder blade, which you can, you can reach and find that. And what you're touching right here is the spine of the scapula, which is a projection. What you're noticing there with doing that is you're actually touching muscle. If I tell you find your shoulder blade and then I say move your finger up above it and push in, that's painful, right? It's tender. That's because you're on a muscle. And then down below, if you go below, that's also a muscle. That's why it's tender. But that is also adding protective characteristic to the bone, which brings us really right into the different functions of bones and what they do for us. So obviously the bones are going to provide us with support. They're going to help us stand up. And it's kind of an interesting interaction and relationship between bones and muscle, because bones are pushers. They're pushers. They're the structural support, and then the muscles are the pullers. So between your bones and your muscles, you kind of got this relationship where you're standing upright because you have the bones pushing and the muscles pulling at the same time. It's kind of like leaning two sticks against each other. One can't stand without the other, right? So that's kind of the relationship that we have between bones and muscle. It's a very interesting one. Pretty remarkable. We also know that bones allow for movement. So the muscles pull on the bones to allow for movement. We'll discuss that more so when we get to the muscles. But remember that bones do not initiate movement. Bones are moving in response to muscular pulling.
No,
Right.
They are designed to. Pocket with the femur.
Yes.
No, it doesn't.
That's a
move
great pickup. Bones do allow and bones do move within the joints, right? So between two bones, if we take a humerus and stick it here where it usually belongs, between the two we get movement, right? So bones do allow for that movement through joint action. Yes, joint movement. All right. What else? Let's see. Bones also store minerals. Say, drink your milk, because milk has calcium, and calcium keeps your bones strong, right? Believe that to be entirely true? You wondered about that? Milk does have calcium in it. There are other sources of calcium. Now, I can talk a little bit about calcium in a little bit. Phosphate's another mineral that's stored here. And the reason why is because that's how bones form. You're going to have these, and we're going to talk about it, you have these collagen fibers that are laid down. Remember collagen? So you got collagen fibers laid down, and then what you do is you throw some liquid matrix on top of it. We talked about the matrix, right? So it's kind of like cement, liquid cement. And then after a while it hardens. So that's where you get the stored minerals. But your body can go and take those minerals if it needs to. So if your body's blood calcium levels are decreasing, because your body needs calcium for various things like blood clotting and muscular contraction and you name it, if your body doesn't have enough calcium in the blood, it'll start to go to the bone and pull the calcium and break down the bone to get more calcium. We'll talk about that as well. Hematopoietic tissue, housing hematopoietic tissue. That's a mouthful. So does anybody know what hematopoiesis is? What's a hematologist? Yeah, blood. Okay, so hemato refers to blood. And then when we talk about poiesis, that means production of, or making of.
So it's basically.
Production of blood. You got it. So hematopoietic tissue is the tissue that makes your blood. Bone marrow. So we're going to talk about the different types of bone marrow and how different types of bone marrow has different types of functions, but we have a red bone marrow that's responsible for hematopoiesis, making red blood cells. Okay, so that's occurring. Storing fat in a different type of marrow called yellow marrow, and then also producing hormones. Okay, so bones do a lot more than we think. We think bones are just there to protect us and provide us with the ability to move and and provides for structure, but they also serve some other functions as well. And sometimes we overlook that. Okay, before we take a break, I'm just gonna introduce you to some of the characteristics of long bones. And then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll jump into some other things. But let's, all right, so looking at this picture, what we see here is what we call a typical long bone. So what we see in the long bone is that we're introduced to two different types of bone. One type of bone here, and we see another type of bone here. This is the type of bone right here that Alex was talking about. That kind of looks like dough, or like rising dough, or if you have a piece of baked bread and you kind of rip into the bread, you can kind of see these little air pockets in there. Well, that's called spongy bone, and that's a bone that we really didn't introduce you to when we covered the tissues. Spongy bone has a couple of different purposes, but one of the aspects of spongy bone, or one of the purposes of spongy bone, was kind of hit on when you were talking about your general impressions of the bone. You said you couldn't believe how light the bone was, right? How it wasn't very heavy at all. And that's largely due to the significant amount of spongy bone that is found in the bones of the body. So spongy bone is there to lighten the bones, so the bones aren't quite so heavy, to lighten the skeleton. And those little bony pieces that you see kind of coming together, and I can show you that. One of these has a nice. Grab it here. Here. All right, so if you take a look at this bone, well, where am I? Here. Focus. Right here. Autofocus isn't so great. Okay, there we go. You can see it looks like little strings in there. It's called trabecula. These are called trabecula. So you've got these little strings here. Now these are collagen fibers. The collagen fibers, you lay down the minerals on top of it, but you can see these little pockets in here. Now think of spongy bone not also as lightening the tissue, but also providing another function. Think about dense, irregular connective tissue. What do we say about dense, irregular connective tissue? What's the function of dense, irregular connective tissue? Withstand tension in how many directions? All directions, multiple directions. You see how spongy bone kind of is like that too? You got trabecula laid down in all these different orientations. You can see there's some organization to it. You can see how we get these lines that are running. You can kind of see some lines, but you can also see some other random arrangement here. So spongy bone, in addition to making the bones light, it's also going to be providing structural integrity to the bone, that the bone can withstand tension in multiple directions, even though it's very light. Thanks to those collagen fibers that are laid down very randomly and that have the minerals laid down on top of them. So that's the spongy bone that we're talking about. Now, spongy bone also has a lot of going to my PowerPoint here. Also has a lot of blood in it. So they're not showing it in here, but if you took a regular spongy bone and you cut into it, not dried out, that's living tissue inside of a person. All these pockets are filled with blood. So it's also blood storage. And it's also blood production. This is actually where you would see like the red bone marrow, usually in the spongy bone. So anyway, let's look at the characteristics and the landmarks of this bone before we take a break, and we'll come back and we'll review. All right. So in a typical long bone, you have two ends of the bone. We got an end here, and we have an end here. And these ends are called epiphyses. Singular is epiphysis. All right? So remember our directional terminology, proximal and distal?
Yes.
Okay, that's what we got here. So this is the humerus. So this is closer to the attachment point of the bone or the limb, and this is further from the attachment point. So this would be attaching to the scapula to form the shoulder joint, and then down here, this would be the elbow, forming the elbow joint. So between the epiphyses, we have the shaft of the bone, and the shaft of the bone is called the diaphysis. And in the diaphysis, we have a hollow opening here, a cavity called the medullary cavity. And what does medullary refer to? Does anybody know what medullary means? The word that also starts with M. What do you see in here? Yeah, marrow. So this medullary means marrow. So medullary is the marrow cavity. Now a couple other things we see here. We see something called the epiphyseal line right here. I'm going to clear the screen off so we can see the actual epiphyseal line. But here's an epiphyseal line. And this is actually the other makeup of the other type of bone that we're more familiar with, which is compact bone. Remember the compact bone? Remember the bone tissue we looked at? Looked like rings, concentric rings? That's compact bone. And you can see here that this epiphyseal line is made up of compact bone. It's a line of compact bone. But you also notice that around the periphery of the entire bone is compact bone. So the bone is outlined by compact bone. Actually, the diaphysis is mostly compact bone. Very little spongy bone. The epiphyseal line is a remnant of something called the epiphyseal plate. What do you think that we commonly call that? What's that?
The growth plate.
You got it, the growth plate, yes. So the epiphyseal line is the remnant of the growth plate. So when and we're going to talk about how bones grow, but basically the epiphyses grow apart from each other. Moves this way, this moves this way, and then the bone grows in between, grows longer. This is how bones grow. So once a person has reached skeletal maturity, the cartilage that was found in this epiphyseal plate, the cartilage then calcifies and becomes bone, and then we're left with the bone, the epiphyseal line, and no more growth occurs to the bone.
I'm just what gets in between bone or what?
The question is what grows, what's in between here that allows for the growth? It's actually cartilage. So the cartilage in that epiphyseal plate, and I'll talk to you about it a little bit later today. The cartilage in that epiphyseal plate, part of it will calcify. And so it's very similar to that basal layer of the epithelium, the epidermis, the basal layer of the epidermis. You have new cells that are being pushed up, and then as those cells move up, they calcify and become bone.
Okay.
So you constantly have cartilage cells that are being given off, growing upward or outward, and then they calcify, and that forms a new bone. So as that continues to happen, the bone gets longer and longer and longer. So we'll come back to that. That's a great question. All right, so we have the epiphyseal line. We also have some sort of connective tissue covering that surrounds the outside of the bone, and this is called the periosteum. Peri means surrounding, or the outside of. Outside. Osteum refers to the bone, so this is around the bone. This is a connective tissue covering. This is innervated. Does anybody know what innervated means? Yeah, it's got a connection to the nervous system, a nerve supply. So if you break your bone and you tear the periosteum, it's going to be painful. It's going to hurt. Okay, so you do have some nervous feedback or pain feedback. We call it nociception coming from the bones, and it's related to the periosteum. Inside the bone, lining the medullary cavity, we also have something very similar to that called endosteum. The same type of connective tissue covering, except this is on the inside of the bone. Don't have anything else that I wanted to get in here. I think we're good. Now, what I want you to notice is that this, and I pointed to it already, that this bone has yellow bone marrow in it. Yellow bone marrow is fat. So this is an energy store. So this is like, have you ever given a dog a bone to chew on? You know, like a long bone like this, and you cracked open so the medullary cavity is exposed, the bone marrow, those dogs just go nuts, right? They love that yellow marrow. They'll just eat that up. So the yellow marrow is a fatty marrow. It's energy storage. You'll find that the long bones in adults are filled with yellow bone marrow. But the medullary cavities in adolescents, younger children, are filled with red marrow. Okay, so there's a switch. So in the long bones, initially, the bones are filled with yellow marrow, but then as we reach adulthood and continue through adulthood, the long bones are largely replaced with yellow bone marrow. All right, so we're right up against the break here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a break, and then we come back. What I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you review what we just talked about. Well, we can do that a little bit later. We'll review the structure of the long bone. We'll just keep going on when we get back, and we'll start talking about the microscopic anatomy of bone and compare and contrast the spongy bone and the compact bone. And then when we kind of change things up a little bit, we'll come back and then we'll review the structure of the long bones. All right, so we'll take 10. So we'll come back at about, I don't know, 3 after 10, and then we'll go from there. All right?
Oh, goodness.
Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the structure of bone, how bone tissue is made. I know we talked a little bit about it when we looked at it under a microscope, when we were looking at the different tissues of the body. But now what we're going to do is we're going to look at what are the parts that you're actually seeing, what's going on, what is it made of, how is it composed, what are the actual structures that you see, so you get a good understanding of how bone tissue is made and what it's made of and how it's arranged. Okay, what we see here on this picture is a typical flat bone. And this is what I was talking about earlier when we talked about what I call the sandwich of bone. And this is kind of how the bones develop as far as flat bones are concerned. We're going to talk about different types of bone growth. This is what we would call the interstitial type of bone growth from within, outward. So what we see here is that there is this, if you look at the bone of the skull, which is a flat bone, you're going to see that there is a layer of spongy bone sandwiched between two layers of compact bone. And then this is a closer, the bottom what you see here is a closer picture of the actual spongy bone. And remember that those little pieces or those little bits of bone that kind of look stringy or kind of looks, it was described as sort of like bread, baked bread. That is what we call trabecula. We call those the trabecula of the spongy bone. All right, so let's take a look at the compact bone. And what we're seeing here in compact bone, what they're trying to show you are the collagen fibers and how the collagen fibers are running in certain orientations in one layer, and then we have another layer which they run a different direction. And what we're seeing are concentric layers of bone. Remember, if you looked at compact bone under the microscope, when we were talking about the tissues, you had multiple rings of bone and then a dark spot in the middle of it, right? Yeah, that's what these layers are, the concentric layers. So that's the outer layer, then the inner layer, and then the inner layer to that, and then we have the hole here. So you can see what's in that hole are the vascular structures and the nervous structures. So if we look at a compact bone, we can see that we have those multiple rings, those concentric rings. And each one of those rings is called an osteon, or we call it a Haversian system. And we brought one out here. So you can see that we brought out one of those osteons or Haversian systems. So the compact bone is divided into these units called osteons. And right in the middle of that osteon is something called a central canal or a Haversian canal. And you can see that we have the blood vessels and the nerves running through that. So how do we get the nerves and blood vessels to run through the bone like this? What are your thoughts? Let's look at it this way. Let's say that I have cement that I'm looking at putting in. But I need to run I need to run electrical lines or electrical cords and gas lines through the cement. Okay, so is it easier to put the gas lines and the power lines and everything in first and then pour the liquid concrete over it, or is it much easier to put in the concrete, let it harden, and then try to drill the holes and then shove them through the holes after that? What's easier?
Probably putting in the lines first and then the concrete.
I would agree. Putting the lines first and then pouring the concrete over it. And that's exactly what happens here in the bone. So in the question, which came first, the blood vessels and the nerves or the bone? The answer is the blood vessels and the nerves came first, then the bone formed around it. It's much easier. Okay, so that's what we see, and that's why we see these nice canals that are built into the bone with the blood vessels and nerves, and it looks like the blood vessels and nerves are running through and they're poking through No, they're not poking through. They were actually there before the bone was formed. So that's what you see. Now, here's the thing. In living bone tissue, you will see the blood vessels and the nerves. But what we saw was something that looked like this, right? So everything is died off. So you're just left with this big hole in the middle that looks dark. But you can see in living tissue, the blood vessels and nerves are there. All right, so if we look a little bit closer at the circumferential lamella, and that's what they call these rings. So the rings are called lamella, circumferential lamella, because it runs around the circumference of the osteons and the compact bone. We can see that we have the different lines. But in the lines, and if you look at this picture, you notice all these little black holes here. You see them? Maybe you noticed them when you were looking at the bone tissue. But these are actually little homes that once housed the actual bone cell. So when the bone is living, inside those little holes are the osteocytes. Remember, cyto refers to a cell. Osteo refers to bone, right? So an osteocyte is a bone cell. Yeah. Different types of bone, or just different stages. What are the different types of bone cells? But they're different stages of bone cell development. Osteocyte is the adult version of a bone cell. It's the grown-up, the mature bone cell. And the mature bone cell lives inside that little hole, which is called a lacuna. Lacuna is not only a name that's given to this pocket in the bone cell, it's given to any sort of pocket that forms that's going to house something. So you might see lacuna show up somewhere else. So a single lacuna ends with an A plural lacuna, or referring to multiple lacuna, ends in an E. We don't say lacunas, we just say lacuna. Sounds the same, but we just add the E to the end of it. All right, so that's what we're seeing. We also see these little cracks and crevices that kind of run out from the osteocytes. These are sort of like communication ports. They're like networks. They allow for the bone cells to talk to each other, because it gets kind of lonely when you're surrounded by hard bone and you have nobody to talk to. So the bone cells can communicate with each other through these channels or networks called canaliculi, right here. Okay. Canaliculi, kind of like canals. Think of canal. Canaliculi. All right, so just to review, we've got the osteon, which is the Haversian system. Same thing, different name, just named after a person, I'm guessing. So we have the osteon, we have the central canal. Then we have the circumferential lamella, made up of the multiple layers of compact bone. Surrounding those circumferential lamella are lacuna, and inside the lacuna, we have the osteocyte, which is the mature bone cell, and then those bone cells can talk to each other through the way of the canaliculi. That sum it up pretty well for you? Feel pretty good about that? Okay, so I mentioned the osteocyte as the bone cell. That's the mature bone cell, as we see here. But we've got some other bone cells. We have an entirely different bone cell here called the osteoclast. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But we also have the osteogenic cell. This is the stem cell. This is the cell that has determined it will become a bone cell, but it hasn't determined which one is going to be yet. And so an osteogenic cell will either become an osteoblast or it will become an osteoclast. All right? So it's got two options. Are we going to build bone or are we going to break it down? That's the question. Are we going to build bone or are we going to break it down? So the first one that we see to the right of the osteogenic cell is the osteoblast. This is the immature bone cell. This is the cell that's going to lay down the liquid concrete, so to speak. So this is the concrete. This is the mason. This is the one that's going to be laying down the cement. Okay. Wet cement. So that's why they call it the matrix synthesizing cell. It's going to lay down the liquid bony matrix, which will eventually harden and become the hard bone. So for building bone, it's done through the osteoblast. The builder. Right? So the osteoblast is the bone builder. It's immature. It's responsible for bone growth. If bone is growing, it's because the osteoblast is laying down new liquid matrix. It's laying down wet cement. All right, so this immature cell does a great job of doing that, produces the matrix. But I want you to picture that let's say that you were the osteoblast, except you were you, and you have a bunch of wet cement, and you're standing in a very, very deep cavern, and around you is a mold where they're going to pour the cement into. Let's say it's about 10 feet high, and so you say, okay, just pour the cement around me, and so they pour the cement around you, and then they walk away. Okay, you can't get out. 10 feet is too high to jump out. Bone cells don't move; they just kind of stay there. But now all of a sudden, when it hardens, here you are surrounded by. That's what happens to the osteoblast. The osteoblast basically surrounds itself with the liquid bone matrix, then that bone matrix hardens, and where it's standing is the lacuna, and it's surrounded by compact bone. See? And then as it matures and becomes the osteocyte, now it's its job just to maintain the bone matrix. So it just keeps it healthy, keeps it viable, keeps it going. So bone tissue is living tissue. Living tissue that constantly can remodel itself and reshape itself. So bone is not a stagnant, non-living, moving tissue. It actually does remodel itself as time goes on. And that's done through the balancing of the activity of the osteoblast and the osteoclast. The osteoclast is the opposite of the osteoblast. This is the bone resorbing cell. So this is what I mentioned before. Let's say that your body's blood calcium levels are dropping. So if you think about that homeostatic mechanism where we have the teeter-totter, if blood calcium levels go down, we have a negative feedback system that's going to do what to blood calcium levels? Bring it back up. The negative feedback system does the opposite, right? So what's going to happen is your body's going to say, okay, blood calcium levels are dropping. We're not getting it through the diet. We're not getting it through anywhere else. We need to find it from somewhere. We need to go to where it's stored. So it goes to the bone, activates the osteoclast. The osteoclast starts reabsorbing the bone, starts breaking down the bone and then releasing into the circulation calcium to bring calcium levels back up. So the osteoclast is going to break down the bone. It's going to resorb it to allow for more calcium to be released. We also see osteoclast activity occurring when someone breaks a bone, because there's a bony callus that forms around the bone to protect it. And then over time, that callus gets smaller and smaller and smaller and more slim. And so the mechanism of action, or what's going on there to break down and shrink that bony callus, that's being done by the osteoclast. So the bones are constantly going through building and remodeling. You'll also notice that inside the compact bone is some spongy bone. You see it here, made up of those trabeculae. Bony trabeculae. And you can see how things are just kind of woven in between. So the blood vessels are there already, remember? And then we just lay down the trabecula on top of it. It's not as organized as the osteon and the Haversian systems, but it still provides the tensile strength. So if you want to think of the compact bone as sort of like the dense regular connective tissue model, where you have the collagen fibers that are all running in generally the same direction. And then if you look at, again, the spongy bone as the compact irregular connective tissue model, where you have layers of collagen fibers that are just laid down randomly, that's kind of a good approximation of how they're set up. Okay, so we have two different ways that bones grow. And the bone growth or formation is called ossification. We're making bone. The first one is the intramembranous ossification. That's the one that's going to result in the formation of, for example, a flat bone. So the end product of intramembranous ossification is exactly what you see here, the bone sandwich. You've got two layers of compact bone surrounding an inner layer of spongy bone. That's what we're going to see. All right, so before we're born, we have this fibrous connective tissue membrane. It's this embryonic connective tissue membrane called mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is made up of mesenchymal cells. And the mesenchyme is represented by this sort of purplish tissue here. So you can see the mesenchymal cell. Look, we have collagen fibrils that are going to become collagen fibers. Well, what's going to happen here is some of these cells within the mesenchyme are going to say, hey, I've decided something today. I'm going to become a bone cell. And the cell next to it says, hey, I was thinking the same thing. Let's become bone cells together. And there's a cluster of them that say, hey, let's all be bone cells. Okay. So when they all decide to become bone cells, they form what's called an ossification center. Smack dab right in the middle of this mesenchyme. These rebels are deciding to become bone, all right? But they're still surrounded by the mesenchyme. So what do these immature bone cells start to do? What do osteoblasts start to do? Secrete bone matrix, liquid matrix. So they start to surround themselves with cement. They surround themselves with this liquid matrix. And what is the matrix going to do? Eventually, it's going to harden. And then those cells are going to mature and they're going to become osteocytes surrounded by bone matrix, calcified, hard. So around the periphery of that bone, you're going to have inspired mesenchymal cells that say, hey, we want to join in the party and we want to become bone cells too. And so what happens is they start becoming osteoblasts and they secrete their own bony matrix. And so you see how the bone is going to start to grow outward, but it's always surrounded by this mesenchyme. So as this bone starts to grow, it starts to remodel itself. And what we're seeing developing on the inside is not necessarily compact bone, but the spongy bone that's in the middle of that sandwich. And as this embryo is developing, the blood vessels are being laid down. And so, hey, don't mind if I do. I'm going to kind of just, I'm forming my bone tissue, but I'll kind of work around you. We'll work together. So you got kind of got the laying down of the blood vessels and the bone that's forming around it. When we get along famously, we get along just fine. But you can see the spongy bone is now taking shape here in the middle of the mesenchyme. But now the mesenchyme, as we're getting closer to the fetal period of development, that mesenchyme is now going to start to condense, and it's going to take on a different characteristic and quality. The mesenchyme is actually going to become the periosteum. And so now we have the periosteum, which forms from the mesenchyme. The periosteum now has differentiated from the mesenchyme. And so now what we see now is that we have the spongy bone in the middle. In the periphery, we started laying down the bone in a more organized fashion in the compact bone. We've still got osteoblasts along the periphery out here. And then outside of that, we have the periosteum. So this is what happens here. We start to form that bony sandwich. And this is how the flat bones form. And some other of the other bones as well. But that's what we see. We see the intramembranous ossification. This is the formation of bone from mesenchymal tissue. Okay? So if you want to write that down, that'll probably be helpful. So intramembranous ossification comes from what we call the mesenchyme. So we have ossification occurring within the mesenchyme. There's no cartilage involved here. No cartilage. And that's another thing you want to write in. No cartilage involved. Okay? So intramembranous ossification, spontaneous bone growth from within the mesenchyme. No cartilage involved. And this primarily occurs in the flat bones, the irregular bones, I'm guessing. Cranial bones and clavicles, it says. So let's just stick to what the note says, so I'm not contradicting what it says. So intramembranous would be cranial bones and clavicles. We'll just stick to that. Might be other ones, but we'll just leave it at that. Okay, so the next type of ossification that occurs, or the other type of ossification that occurs, is one that I would say if you have any sort of background in science and you were talked about bones or you talked about bone development, you probably were familiar with, on some level, with the endochondral ossification model. Because you say, you know, babies' bones are mostly cartilage, and then as babies get older, then the cartilage becomes bone, right? You may have heard that somewhere along the line. And that's accurate, that's true. That is the endochondral ossification model. So what you start off with here in fetal development, well, actually the end of embryonic, by the time you reach the fetal stage of development, you already have your skeleton in place. Mostly cartilaginous, but I digress. Anyway, so during the embryonic period, you have your skeleton form, and particularly the long bones. So you're thinking of the bones of your fingers and your limbs and so forth, your ribs. They're already in place, but they're cartilage models of what the bones are going to become. All right, so you have cartilage precursors of your bony skeleton. So very similar to what happened in the intramembranous ossification, but remember, intramembranous ossification didn't have any cartilage involvement. So in the middle of the intramembranous ossification, I'm sorry, back up. In the middle of the cartilage, just like in intramembranous ossification, but now we're talking about cartilage, not mesenchyme. In the cartilage, you have some cells, cartilage cells, that decide to ossify. They become bone, all right? So instead of in the intramembranous ossification, in the mesenchyme, the bone, they just decide they're going to be bone cells. Here in the cartilage, we have cells that decide to become bone cells. This is why it's called the endochondral ossification. Because remember, chondro means cartilage. So use the terminology to help you. This is the endochondral ossification, so we're coming from cartilage. The intramembranous comes from a membrane called mesenchyme, see? So that'll kind of help you differentiate the two. So inside the middle of what's going to become the diaphysis, we have these bones, or cells that decide to become bone. The primary ossification center. You'll also see along the side of the diaphysis, we also form what's called a bone collar. So some cells are already turning into bone around the outside. What you see developing here is that we have the deteriorating cartilage matrix, which is being replaced with bone. And now we're setting up the medullary cavity inside. You can see that. See this little hole in here? This is the medullary cavity, surrounded and lined by bone cells, and we have the bone collar here. Now we get the blood vessel that starts to set up within the bone itself. And then once we get the blood involved, now we're off to the races. Because now this bone growth occurs much quicker, because now we're bringing in oxygen and nutrients into the tissue. So it really takes off, and we see a nice development of the endochondral, of the medullary cavity, sorry, I was getting my terminology mixed up. The medullary cavity, we see that developing around the blood vessels. So that by the time we get to around birth, what we see are bones that are primarily bony in the diaphysis, but are primarily cartilaginous on the epiphyses. But you can see here, boom, we get a nice little secondary ossification center that starts to form. So as we move from birth into childhood, adolescence, what we see is that that secondary ossification really takes off. And so we've got some nice spongy bone here in each of the epiphyses. But the cartilage sticks around. And we see that we have this nice hyaline cartilage lining the ends of the bones. This forms the articular surface. Remember we talked about hyaline cartilage, how it was at the end of the bones? So if you take a chicken bone and you snap off the meat of the bone, you can see the nice shiny cartilage on it. Okay, that's the articular cartilage. That's the remnant of that cartilaginous model that had developed before birth. We also see, Myra here, the epiphyseal plate made up of cartilage, hyaline cartilage. So that's what it is. That growth plate is a cartilaginous plate. And then the bones will continue to grow and remodel. So the epiphyses will grow away from each other. And as it does that, we lay down new bone, new bone, new bone, new bone, and that bone just keeps getting longer and longer. So this is the endochondral ossification model. We start with a cartilage model, and then the cartilage becomes bony. You see the difference between the two? Yeah, go ahead, Myra.
I was wondering, because I kind of have like a picture in my head. Balls are really, really soft.
Yes.
Because obviously, they have to be soft in order to get through the birth.
Yes.
So while they're forming their skull, because they've got to build the bone over time to protect the brain.
Okay, so the question, Myra, just so everybody can hear the question, you're kind of thinking of babies' skulls as being relatively soft when they're born, and you're wondering, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're wondering which type of ossification that falls under. Actually, it's not gonna fall under this one. Remember that the bones of the skull are formed through the intramembranous ossification. So the answer to your question is the bones are pretty much formed. So we have actual bony skull, but what we don't have is the establishment of the bony sutures that unite the bones of the skull. So let me see if I can find a different. Let me just see if I can find in my other. I don't know if I have it of the. I don't have it of the skull of the infant. If you want to go ahead and, does someone have their book that I can look in their book at chapter 7? We might open up your book to chapter 7. Someone got it close? You got it here. Oh, okay, let me see if I can find it quickly here in Mala's book. So I know they have a picture of it somewhere. I'm wondering if I'm missing it, if I'm going to take a look beyond it. Do they not have a picture in here? Interesting. Okay, if you go to page 244 in your book. Want me to leave the page open to you?
Yeah.
There. Set that. Yeah. If you've got your book, page 244, it's gonna be figure 736. It's right in the upper left-hand corner of your page. What they're showing is that there's a membrane that forms between the bones of the skull called a fontanelle. And so what happens is the fontanelles is are made up of like a soft membrane. So the bones can actually slide over each other if they need to, or they can just cave up. So sometimes when moms are pushing for a long time and the baby's born, it looks like it has a cone head. That's because the fontanelle is soft and the bones are just kind of shifted to allow for that head to pass through the birth canal. So it's not really, the softness of the skull is not related to the bone not being mature, so to speak, or bony. Not that it's cartilaginous, it's just that the bones are held together by this soft membrane, which allows the skull to expand as the baby grows and also to allow for the movement during birth. And as we mature and as we get older, those will start to close up and they'll form the sutures, which we'll see that form the fibrous joints between the bones of the skull. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Okay, good. Great. Okay, let's change gears a little bit and I'll share a story with you. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about the different parts of the aspects of the bone. We'll do a little bit of review here before we go on. Okay, so I'm going to darken it up in here so everybody can kind of see this X-ray here. I want to make sure that I'm still showing everybody this. Not that, okay, I am okay. Good. Not that I am thinking I'm displaying this to everybody and I'm not. Okay, so here's a story that I want to share with you. This is my younger daughter Ava. Well, this is not her. This is an X-ray of her. So this happened when Ava, she's now 6, but she was about 2, and we were at a restaurant. She was, she was 2, so she could walk already, obviously, for quite some time. But when they're walking, you still stumble around a little bit. And she might have even been less than 2. I don't know. But anyway, she was young, really young. And we were at a restaurant, and she was wearing some shoes that she hadn't worn before. And so she was walking to go to the bathroom, and she kind of got the bottom of her shoe caught on the carpet, and she tripped and fell. Got up, and she started crying. And she couldn't put any weight on her leg, and she was kind of holding her hip area. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. But if you know children, little children, especially really, really young children, even young children, if children complain of hip pain or they complain of any sort of joint pain, that is not normal. Usually kids are pretty, they don't really have aches and pains until they start getting into their adolescence, getting toward puberty when they start growing a little bit more. But traditionally kids don't complain much. So I'm thinking, okay, knowing what I know, let's just see how she does. And maybe it hurts just a little bit because maybe she fell and she's got some pain. But then that was in the evening, and then the next morning she woke up and she still was not putting any weight on her leg. This is the right leg. She wasn't putting any weight on it. So I'm like, okay, now we got to go in and see what's going on and make sure there's nothing going on here, nothing more serious. So we took her in to get an X-ray, and they went and took the X-ray. And after she was on the X-ray and we got all the X-rays that we needed, she hops off the table and she walked away. No pain again. I'm thinking that's typical, right? But who knows? Maybe something was not completely kosher, and then laying on the table and kind of moving the hip around and stuff like that in the positions they needed. Maybe it slid something back into place or whatever. I don't know. But she felt better after. So it was a therapeutic X-ray because she felt better after. Great, good. But what I was really, I'm like, well, if anything, at least I'm going to walk away with X-rays because I want to show this to my class. Because I was like, I'm not salivating. I'm not that geeked up about anatomy, but I'm like, this is a great opportunity here to catch an image of an immature skeleton. And so what you see here on this picture is fantastic, because if you look right here, you can see this little ball here, right? And then there's like a space, and then here's the beginning of the other bone. You see that? So what's this? This is the femur, by the way. This bone.
It's supposed to be the socket.
Yeah, that's in the socket. It's supposed to be in the socket, and it is. There's nothing wrong with it being where it is. It's floating around in there.
I'm just saying, like, if it was developed, it would be that ball that sits in.
Correct. It would be the ball that sits in there. So what is that called on a long bone? The end of the bone is called the epiphysis. So this is the epiphysis. And because this is an immature bone, what is between the epiphysis and the diaphysis? The epiphyseal plate, the growth plate. So cartilage doesn't show up on X-ray. Bone does, but cartilage doesn't. That's why you see a space. You see that? I'll back it off again so you can see it. I'll take it up. See the space there? So if you look at this and you say, holy cow, it's no wonder she's in pain. She broke her bone. No, that's not the case. That's how it looks. And you can also even see spaces between the bones of the hip, because the hip joint actually is made up of 3 different bones coming together: the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. And those 3 bones will come together in the hip socket. And so you can see here the space between the bones. You have to kind of blur your eyes a little bit and kind of imagine, but you can see the space between those bones. See that? Down here at the distal epiphysis of the femur, nice growth plate. Here's distal epiphysis. Here's the diaphysis. Now, because we're rotating, sometimes we overlay things. So there actually is a space there. You can see it. Can you see how there's what appears a separation of bone too at the other side of the knee?
Yes.
The tibia. So this is typical. This is what you're going to see in immature skeletons. You can see the knee joint really well now. See that? Here are your growth plates. Here's a nice growth plate here. And you can see that. Now you can see a nice space between the bones of the hip. See that? I'll take away the lines again so that you can see it better. But I'm just kind of showing you what to look for here. You see it? So this is a nice, fantastic picture of an immature skeleton. And I was like, give me those x-rays. At least give me that. So I got out of there with x-rays. So I was happy about that. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at that epiphyseal plate, that growth plate that is cartilaginous. That's why it looks like a gap on the x-ray. And so as I said before, the bone is going to grow epiphyses away from epiphyses. So that's our second term for today, term growth. Bless you. Something else I want to share with you. My daughters and I, my whole family actually was in Florida right before the start of the semester. I had a couple of weeks between summer and the start of the fall semester, and we said, let's go down and take a vacation in Florida. And so we were in Orlando, and we saw this huge Ferris wheel. It's called the Eye. Everybody heard of this thing in Orlando? It takes like 20 minutes for you to go around the thing. It just moves really slowly. You go around. We're like, let's go in the Eye. Yeah, for the 3 of us to go in, it was like $70. And I'm like, I'm not paying $70 for a 20-minute ride. Sorry. But as we were walking toward the Eye, we walked past this building, and it said Skeleton Museum. I'm like, that sounds interesting. So after we knew the Eye was out, I said to my girls, Brianna's 10 and Ava's 6, I said, how would you like to go check out the Skeleton Museum? Yeah, let's do this. And there were hundreds of skeletons there. Every animal, mythical and real, every animal that you could possibly think of, they had a skeleton, full articulated skeleton of it. It was pretty cool. So this is, what do they call this, a minotaur? What is it called? Yeah, that's half man, half horses it's supposed to be. So they're having fun with it, but some pretty interesting stuff. So like here they have the turtles and the snakes, and they had all sorts of things. And my girls, this is a very blurry picture, it didn't turn out well, but this is my girls in front of the turtles. They wanted me to take pictures of them with certain things. So here's Ava, yeah, there she's a ham. But we had some good time. Here's a cobra. Here are the girls again. They've been making their faces again. But here's the giraffe. Here's the elephant. Here's a hippo. And one thing I was having fun with Brianna, because she's old enough, and Ava kind of got it too. But looking at the mammals, we said, how many bones are in the neck of a person? And we looked at a person's neck, and we saw 7 bones. This is Dad, the anatomy teacher, now trying to educate my child as she's going through. But then we said, okay, let's look at all the different mammals, and went through and said, how many bones are in the neck, do you think? 7. And we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the elephant, 7, hippo, 7, even the giraffe, 7. Even though they're very large bones, but there's only 7 bones in the giraffe's neck, just like any other mammal. Here's some other ones. But here's the elephant. I want to get to some interesting ones here. These are the bears. There's a bear. Platypus. Okay, so here some interesting things. They had an area of human bones, and it's kind of hard to see here, so I'll kind of zoom it in a little bit. But they're talking about the binding of feet, how they used to bind human feet. You ever heard of this?
Yes.
Binding feet. So what they would do is they would bind the feet to make the foot appear smaller. And what they were describing here in some of the other cultures of the world is that they would bind the foot to make it smaller, and then it would be very difficult for this person to walk. But it was a sign of wealth, and it was a sign that you were wealthy, because if you could get your feet bound, it meant that you were not fit to work in the fields. That was actually a thing that was a sign of wealth. So what they did is they compared this foot, which is the bound foot, with the normal human foot. You can see over here next to it, they've got the the hardware on the backbone. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Go out of here so I can. Here's something that when we think about bone remodeling, this is not the Cyclops calf. I'll show you that anyway. But what they're showing here, pectoral, no. What's a foot binding? No, I guess I'm not catching the label here, but I can tell what it is. So sometimes you take a nice shot to a part of your body. What happens is you break blood vessels. And what is in blood? We talked about before. If your blood, what levels get low? Calcium. So sometimes when you take a severe shot to the muscle of your body, what happens is you get what's called the term just slipped my mind here. I'll remember it, but I can't remember what it is. But anyway, what happens is the blood in that muscle will calcify. And sometimes it gets reabsorbed by the body, sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, it'll leave behind something like this, where it's like an extension of the bone. The bone looks actually larger, and looks like it's very irregular in shape. This is not necessarily a bony tumor. It's not cancer. It's just that calcification of the muscle. No, it probably isn't, but it's embedded within the muscle. So the person probably, is uncomfortable, but not extremely uncomfortable. Here you can see it. Here's a collarbone right here, and here's a healed collarbone fracture, and that's that bony callus I was talking about. That the callus forms around that leaves a bump. Here's another one. That's the ulna. That's one of the arm bones. Here's a humerus. There's a broken bone here. As opposed to that, you can see it's got this bulge. So they're just showing you some of the broken, what happens when you break a bone. Which I thought, hey, I'm gonna be an anatomy teacher and at least grab pictures of this stuff. Here are the fontanelles of the baby. See that? Here's the spaces in between the bones of the skull.
Oh, okay.
So that's what it looks like. That's the fetal skull and the newborn skull. Here's the two-headed calf. This is pretty cool. So they were showing like these calves, and that when it was growing, it was two separate heads forming, and then they formed together. So here's a two-headed calf, multi-headed calf. So it had one body but two heads. Here's some other things. There's a cyclops calf, where the orbit for the eye didn't form two separate sides. This is severely deformed anyway. Look, they showed a picture of what it actually looked like. It did not look like a calf. So they just had some other kind of cool things that were cool to see. Here's a hydrocephalic calf. This is this happens in adult and humans too, hydrocephalus. Down here, you see this turtle? I don't know if I got a picture of it by itself, but here's a turtle. And when it was a small turtle, it swam in the middle of one of these rings for cans of soda. And then the turtle got bigger. The ring didn't get much bigger, and so it was found with this and dead with this around it. Here's a two-headed calf. Again, this is two separate necks too. This is what the combined head calf looked like. Here's actually two different necks, two different heads. There it is again, different one. There's the turtle. Kind of cool. Look at that, how it really sandwiched it in. So here's your green message for today. Don't throw away plastic and don't cut things. And here's the development of the skull. So here's the infant skull. Here's a child skull. And then this is child skull 2 to 4 years. So here's the child skull at 30 weeks, so before birth. Newborn skull here, the fontanelle. You can see that there's the space between the bones, so those bones can shift around. By 2 to 4 years, the fontanelles are gone, and those bony sutures are starting to form. But you can see that you have the skull there. So yeah, it was some cool things to see. And I thought, well, let's bring back some pictures for anatomy. Here, this is a picture of severe scoliosis. Look at the back here in this person. So this is their hip bone, and their back goes all the way over here, all the way back over here, and up. So if you imagine living with that, that's pretty interesting. So anyway, some cool stuff that I thought I'd share from that.
Not that it's related or anything. Falls in there, they're not.
Those are the ones that I showed you are probably adult skulls, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but they might be young adult, but they should be around adult size. But people are different sizes.
It just seems
So-
rather small.
Yeah, it seems rather small, but I would say this is an adult skull because they have all their permanent teeth in here and so forth. So yeah, this is an adult skull. Might just be a smaller person.
That just seems like a really small skull compared to what your head size would be.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
This could be very well not saying males can't be small and petite either, but this could be a very petite individual, maybe a female petite, small. So small person, smaller skull. But yeah, those are adult skulls. Okay, so one last thing we'll talk about, and then we'll take another break. Talking about the growth that occurs. Did you get the second term? You got growth, right?
Yes.
Okay, so talking about the epiphyseal plate. So what's happening here now? Now I want you to see that where we are, and where we are is here in the growth plate. Oh, I'm going to switch over here. We're right here in the growth plate. So we've got this is the top of the growth plate here. This is getting toward the bottom of the growth plate here. Okay, so it's cartilaginous. But you can see here, we have an area of cartilage that's not active. It's just in the resting state. But then we have this area here where the cells will undergo mitosis. We talked about mitosis, right? Remember that? Mitosis. So they're going to undergo mitosis. They're going to divide off. And then as those cells move inferiorly in this picture, they're going to get larger. They're going to enlarge. They're going to well, they call enlargement. They call it hypertrophy. So the cells, the cartilage cells, are going to enlarge as they get older. But then they're going to transition. They're going to go from cartilage cells to become calcified. So the matrix is going to calcify. The cartilage cells die, and we start to see blood vessels coming into the area. And so once we get the setup of blood, now we're forming bone tissue. So we see the transition from cartilage to bone tissue, and then this is the new bone here. And so as we keep pushing bone downward, or new cells downward, you can see that the epiphysis is going to grow that way, right? So that's what's happening. So we're pushing down, in this picture, pushing down cartilage cells. Mitosis, they enlarge, they transition into bone, and as it does that, the epiphysis moves upward on this picture. So the epiphyses grow away from each other. There's a hormone that's involved in the control of blood calcium levels called parathyroid hormone. So if we see that if we have falling blood levels, the parathyroid glands in the back of the parathyroid, the back of the thyroid, called the parathyroid, we'll come back to it. Don't get caught up on where the parathyroid gland is. They're going to release parathyroid hormone. Surprisingly, it's that easy. You have a parathyroid gland that secretes parathyroid hormone. Thank the Lord, we have an easy one here. And then that parathyroid hormone is going to activate the osteoclast to pull the calcium out of the bone and stick it into the blood to bring blood calcium levels up. So we'll talk more about bone remodeling and so forth. But I just want to leave you with something toward the bottom of page 4 before we take a break. Oh, I didn't talk about the cartilage growth, and I'll talk about that when we come back. But anyway, hormones can regulate growth. So if you notice on page 4, letter B, number 3, during infancy and childhood, we have growth hormone, which is going to drive the growth of the bones. But then once we reach puberty, then the sex hormones take over, testosterone and estrogen. I'm not saying they completely take over, you still have growth hormone. But what that leads to is the growth spurt, and then that's going to be the beginning of the end. So you're going to see the bones are going to grow rapidly. They're going to take on the gender bone characteristics. So the bones are going to remodel, the skeleton is going to remodel to be more feminine versus masculine. And then those epiphyseal plates are going to start to get to the maturity where they're going to start to close up.
So when you say differs in the men versus.
Yes, that's when you see a difference in the hips in men versus women. The pelvis is going to change, be more round or gynecoid for the female and more heart-shaped for the male. We'll look at the comparison of the different hips between male and female as we move on to next time we're together. All right, so let's go ahead and take another break, and we'll come back in 10, so about 10 after 11, we'll come back together, and then we'll just finish up a little bit on how bones remodel in regard to growth. I'm sorry, remodel in regard to fractures, and then we'll start a little bit on chapter 7. We'll start talking about some of the bones of the skull. All right, so we'll take 10. Okay. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna look quickly at the cartilage. We wanna look at the different types of cartilage formation, which I'm gonna talk to you because I don't have pictures of that. If you go back to page 1, looking at the bottom of page 1, there's the growth of cartilage on letter B of Roman numeral number 1, right at the beginning. Two different types of growth. There's appositional growth and interstitial growth. Listen. Oh, there's a hiccup. Okay, well, excuse your hiccups then. Yeah, all right. So we have interstitial growth, which is number 2. Expansion from within the cartilage matrix. This is very similar to the intramembranous ossification. So if you want to just make a note, interstitial growth of cartilage is similar to intramembranous growth of bone. There you go. And then the appositional growth, outward expansion due to the production of cartilage matrix on the outer face of the tissue. That would be, I would say, more along the lines of kind of like the endochondral ossification model, where you're kind of building on to the outside. They're more like the bony collar that's on the cartilaginous model. I guess kind of like that. But what we're seeing is that the cartilage is either going to, if you've got cartilage, you got the tissue here. Let's say you've got just a collection of tissue. You're going to have a formation of cartilage on the outside. It's going to build like layers of cartilage on the outside, whereas the interstitial growth is kind of like from the inside out. So it's, instead of adding layers to the outside, you're building it from the inside. That's the interstitial. So kind of a contrast between the two. But I just want to hit on that very quickly. But what I want to do is I want to get to the bone remodeling. And we talked a little bit about the different hormones involved in remodeling. But now I want to talk to you about how the bone repairs itself during fractures. So we're going to just look at some concepts. Well, before we do that, let's just look at this picture here. So the rule of thumb is, and what you'll see in bone, is that bone will grow in thickness and add more bone to itself when you place higher tensile strengths upon that bone. So they're giving you the example here of a tennis player. She's right-handed in this case, and she uses her arm for serving the tennis ball and returning, the volleys and so forth. So what they're trying to show you here is that in her serving arm, or the right arm, you can see that there's an additional layer of bone that's added to the circumference of that bone, as opposed to the non-serving arm. So what they're trying to get you to understand here is that the bone will add thickness to it to compensate for the increased tensile strengths that are placed upon it. So in other words, if you're going to use your bones, you're going to use your muscles, you're going to be building bone density. You're going to be increasing bone thickness as a result. That's why with the geriatric, the aging population, they encourage them to be active. Walk, move around, move your muscles, do something. Because what you're doing is you're making those muscles pull on the bones, and when the muscle pulls on the bones, that places tensile stresses upon the bones, which is going to, in turn, build bone density. All right, let's hop to the fractures. There are different types of fractures, and you'll see them listed here in the table. Some look really great, some don't look so fun. Crunch the bones together, that's a comminuted fracture. If you, let's say if you fall from a significant height, compression fracture can happen. If you have osteoporosis in your bones, that can happen. You can also see compression fractures that happen as a pathological fracture. For example, if someone has cancer in their bones, they can suffer compression fractures related to the cancer eating away at the bones. Spiral fracture. So if there's a twisting force placed upon the bone, you can twist and fracture the bone. We have an epiphyseal fracture, which is a fracture through the growth plate. Not fun. Be very careful when you fracture a bone at or near the growth plate, because sometimes that fracture will cause the growth plate to close prematurely. Not good, because it depends on where they are. If they're of relative skeletal immaturity and the growth plate starts closing up, that's a big problem, because you're going to have one growth plate that's going to close before the other, so you're going to have one limb that's longer than the other. That could be a problem, especially if it's your lower extremity. The other term for this, you don't have to write this down, just FYI. Another term for an epiphyseal fracture is called a Salter-Harris fracture, and there are different types of Salter-Harris fracture. Salter, S-A-L-T-E-R, Harris, H-A-R-R-I-S. So it's a Salter dash or hyphen Harris fracture, and there's, I think, 3 or 4 different types of Salter-Harris fracture. Salter-Harris fractures, you don't have to be concerned with that, but if you ever hear that term, that's what it is. We have depression fractures, where you get bashed in the skull and have basically a dent in your skull. We have the green stick fracture. The green stick fracture usually happens on children. Their bones are a little bit more flexible. So like if you've got a tree out in the yard and you grab a nice living branch on the tree and you try to snap it off, you can't. Kind of bends, but it doesn't break. Call that a green stick. Same thing here. So the bone kind of bends a little bit, but it's not a complete fracture. So one side kind of breaks a little bit, the other side just bends. So that's called a green stick fracture. Regardless of how the bone fractures, you're going to see pretty much 4 different stages involved in the healing of a bone fracture. It's very similar to the stages involved in tissue healing. So I think I have these as individual slides. I do. So first we have the first step, which is the hematoma. So basically, because we've ruptured blood vessels, as we fractured the bone, you're going to see blood pool in the area of the fracture. This is a hematoma. You can see that's going to push away the sides of the periosteum. So you're going to see the precursor to the bony callus. So if you are in this stage, it's going to be a little bit unstable, very painful, swollen. You're going to know that there's something going on. Okay? If you have a nice fracture like this, where the bone isn't too bent or too out of shape, too misshapen, then it'll heal pretty nicely on its own. So the next step, we're going to see that the bone is going to start to remodel. And you can see that the blood vessels are being regrown. Okay, so the new blood vessels come in. With the restoration of the blood vessels, now we get a nice supply of oxygen, nutrients, everything we need. And we start to see that where the hematoma was, we're going to clear out the hematoma. And we're going to start to get a cartilaginous type of callus that's going to form, made of fibrocartilage. There are also some spongy bone that's in there from the broken bone. We also have some spontaneous ossification that's going to be occurring here in the area as well. This is the start of the new bone growth, but the first step is to put together that fibrocartilaginous callus to set the stage for the bone growth. This is kind of like the intramembranous ossification, or I guess the endochondral ossification, where it comes from the cartilage model. So through the cartilage, you're going to start to see the bone developing. So eventually that cartilage will be replaced by bone, and we have the formation of the bony callus. Now you can spend quite a bit of time here in the bony callus forms stage, bony callus stage, where the bony callus is formed. And you can see that the bone has restored itself. And then finally, the fracture is healed. Now, it takes time for fractures to heal. And there's a healed fracture and a really, really healed fracture. So it doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter if you've got superpowers, doesn't matter if you're a premier athlete and you quote unquote heal quickly. That just means that you're the way I look at it, when someone says they heal quickly, means that you're able to perform at a high level of function, but just kind of deal with the pain and the discomfort of the continued healing. But when you break a bone, you break a bone, and you're looking at minimum 6 weeks before that bone is considered somewhat healed. 8 weeks to be safe and beyond. So what you'll typically see in a person who has a broken bone is that they're going to be pretty sore at the beginning, and then magically at about week 6, it doesn't hurt so much anymore. For the most part, the pain goes away. That's about when you're at the start of the healing, or I should say the considered healed fracture. But you're going to see that that bone is going to continue to remodel itself. That you're going to have a bony callus, and that callus, depending on how much tensile force you put on it and how far apart the fragments from the fracture are, you're gonna have a remnant of a callus. That callus can get smaller over time as the bone continues to remodel. But it can be years after the fracture that the bone remodels itself. So maybe you've experienced that too. I know I have. I fractured a bone in my finger, and I had a ring that was on that finger, and then over time, when I got the ring placed on the finger, it was when the bone was healed, the callus was bigger. And as the years went on, try to put that same ring on the same finger, the ring is very loose because that callus had remodeled. So remodeling can take place over years. So it's not something that'll happen necessarily in a very short period of time. Okay, I'm going to switch over now. We're going to move over to next chapter, which is chapter 7 of Learning Plan 6. And we're going to actually look at the bones that make up the axial skeleton. Spend a few minutes going through the bones of the skull, and then we'll take some time for closure and review, and then we'll go from there. So first of all, when we look, we're going to start with the skull. And with the skull, you're going to see that we have 2 different parts to the skull. We have the bones of the cranium. So we have the cranial area, and the cranial area is responsible for housing the brain. And then we have the facial bones, which make up the framework of the face. We have one bone that will articulate or touch or come into contact with all the bones of the skull. And that bone is called the keystone bone of the skull. That's called the sphenoid. We'll look at that in a little bit. All right, so the term fossa that you see here on the screen, a fossa, is that a projection when it comes to bone markings, or is that a depression?
I think it's a depression.
It's a depression. Correct. Okay. All right, so here's our skull. All right, so I don't have the picture, the diagram in front of me. So what's this fossa that's toward the front of the skull? Anterior fossa. Okay, so if you're looking at the skull from the side, you're going to see that we've got hard to do this. Watching. So you got the orbits that contain the eyes. So you're going to picture that the front part of the skull is actually a shelf above the orbits. So if you look here, you can see that this is the anterior fossa. There's where the eyeball is. Here's where the other eyeball is. So sitting on top of that eyeball is that anterior fossa. Okay. Then we have a depression here in the middle. So now we're in this area here, so we can go downward a little bit behind the eyes. Now we got this depression in here. What's this one called? Middle fossa. Okay, so here's the middle fossa, and then we go even deeper to the back of the skull, back in here, so this deep region in here. So you can kind of see if I kind of turn at an angle. The anterior fossa, middle fossa, and then we're down in this deep region, which is the posterior, right? The different areas, you can kind of see it three-dimensionally if I hold this up here. So here's the posterior. All right, so what I want to point out to you here also, this is the sphenoid bone right here. This is the keystone. This is the keystone bone of the skull. Okay, up here, and then it's going to down here. Now, right in this region right here, this is called the sella turcica, and this is where the pituitary gland lives, right here. Okay, so right in here. What you're going to see later on as we're talking about the bones of the skull, the sphenoid bone has what we call two different wings. And so you can see here up in the anterior fossa, there's like this shelf where we have a more superior level, and then it drops off. You see how we drop off when we fall down here? So this here, it's hard to see, but you'll see it in the book much better. You'll see that it looks kind of like bat wings right here. This is what we call the lesser wing of the sphenoid, right here. And then down below, deeper, in this middle fossa, is what we call the greater wing of the sphenoid. So just so when you see that term lesser and greater wing, and you see it shown, you understand that the lesser wing is more superior, and the greater wing is more inferior. And the sphenoid bone is where the pituitary gland lives, right in there. Okay? Okay. Obviously, no surprise, the brain is located in the cranium. Okay, so what we're going to see now is multiple views of the skull. What's nice about what the book does is the book will color code these, so they're always going to be the same color no matter how you turn the skull. So you're going to always see that the bones maintain that color. So as we look at the bone from the anterior view, we have this large prominent bone right here in the front. This is called the frontal bone. If we look at the sides of the skull, can't see it very well here, but on each side of the skull, you're going to see it much better on a lateral view. This is what we call the parietal bone. In this pair, there's two of them. Again, you'll see it better on the side of the skull, but you got the temporal bones here and here, makes up the side of the skull. Down here we have this blue bone here, and this is called the zygomatic bone. Makes up the cheekbone, and also the inferior lateral aspect of the orbit, where the eye is located. So when you're looking at this picture, if you're looking for the actual bones, it might be kind of hard to see on this picture. You can probably see it better in your book. Anything that's in bold face, right, is a bone. Okay, even though it doesn't say bone at the end of it. Bone. Okay, so the maxilla, mandible, those are bones. Okay, so here's that sphenoid bone, makes up the back part of the orbit. The sphenoid bone, we'll see a much better picture of that as we go on. Making up the bridge of the nose, you have two bones, 1, 2 here. The bony part of the nose, that's the nasal bone. I already talked about the temporal bone. The ethmoid bone. Ethmoid bone you can't see very well. It's located right here. It's kind of in the medial aspect of the orbit. Ethmoid bone, we're going to see that this bone is quite a large bone, but we don't see much of it from this view. The green bone, clear this off, the green bone that you see right next to the nose, next to the maxilla, which we haven't talked to. This green bone here is called the lacrimal bone. The root for lacrimal, lacrimose, or lacro means to cry or refers to tears. So it's the crying bone or the tear bone. This big purple bone here is what we call the maxilla. Now, we can call it the maxilla, or we can call it the maxillary bone. Two of them. So obviously, if we have two of them, we call them the maxillary bones. Or when we use the term maxilla, when we make it plural, we just add the E. So maxilla with an A is singular, maxilla with an E is plural. The maxilla. We have the jawbone, which is the mandible. We have one of those. This is the only movable bone of the skull. All right, then we have a bone that probably not many of you have ever heard of, called the inferior nasal concha. In the nasal cavity. We also have, now this gets confusing, because remember we saw the ethmoid bone here? Ethmoid bone also is located in the nasal region, the nasal cavity region. And we have a middle nasal concha, and what you can't see is that there's a superior nasal concha, actually up here somewhere. Superior nasal. Okay, so here's where it gets confusing. The middle and superior nasal concha are part of the ethmoid bone, so they are not their own bones. But the inferior nasal concha is its own bone, okay? So that's a tricky thing. So just keep in mind that. We also have this nasal septum here that divides the left side of the nasal cavity from the right side. And the upper part of that, the superior portion of that, is called the perpendicular plate. That's part of the ethmoid bone as well. But then the inferior part of that is this blue bone right here, which is called the vomer. Got the vomer there. They've got them all. All right. Put your calvarium back on. That's what they call the cap of the skull here. Calvarium. Back together. All right. So if we look here, we can see the frontal bone. See, here's the border of the frontal bone. Frontal bone right in here. Side, this large bone here, you can see that it joins in the middle, down here, and then all the way down to here in the back. This huge bone right here is the parietal bone. And on the side of the skull, temporal bone, what we call the temple. Side of the skull. And here, this is the cheekbone. This is the zygomatic bone. Actually, right out to about. It's hard to see where it ends and where the other. Oh, here it is. Okay, so it's hard to see here, but the zygomatic bone actually ends right about here. So this part here is tough because this is called the zygomatic arch. The zygomatic arch is actually part of the temporal bone. So we have a zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone, and we have, which is the zygomatic, that's a bone itself. But then over here we have the zygomatic arch, which is part of the temporal bone. Okay.
Which is similar to the temporal.
Yeah, the temporal bone here. On the temporal bone, you will have part of the temporal bone is that mandibular fossa, which is the temporal part of the temporal mandibular joint. Okay, looking at the skull here, the front, we got the two nasal bones here. Now the eye, the bones in the eye on this is a little trickier, but way in the back is the sphenoid. Then we have the ethmoid bone. Then we have the lacrimal bone here. have the maxilla, which is the facial bone. So the maxilla is going to come out here and travel all the way down here, and then it's one maxilla. This is the other maxilla. Here's that nasal septum we talked about. Nasal septum, which isn't uncommon. Here's the perpendicular plate. That's part of the ethmoid bone. The vomer here. Your nasal concha right here. Middle and superior don't look so great, but here, if you can see it, well, try to differentiate. Middle. All right, so if we turn around the skull now, there's a bone we hadn't seen. That bone up around here, back down here, the back part of the skull and the inferior part of the skull. This is called the occipital bone. Bottom of the occipital bone, we have this hole here, which is called the magnum foramen. It's the largest opening. What comes through this opening here?
Your spine.
Spinal cord. Yep, spinal cord. Then the skull is going to rest on top of the first vertebra with these two structures here, which are part of the occipital bone. This is called the, boy, I hate it when the terms are right there and they slip out of my head. My brain, bring it to me. Occipital condyles. See, the occipital condyles is what rests on top of the vertebrae. We have two processes here. These are called the mastoid processes, or the temporal bone. Yep. Then we have the styloid processes here as well. So these are some structures that you see. You can even see from the back, you can see the vomer bone here. Now, as we look at don't try this at home. That doesn't feel good. As you look at the mouth, the top of the roof of the mouth, we have something called a hard palate, which you see here, and then posterior to that is going to be the soft palate, which is soft. It's tissue. There's no bone there. So the hard palate is made up of two different structures. The anterior part of the hard palate is made up of the maxilla, the maxillary bone. So here's one maxillary bone. Here's the other maxillary bone. And then back here, you have one bone here, one bone here. These are called the palatine bones. So they're smaller. So the palatine bone is here and here. As I'm seeing it here, they kind of come together right about here. Sometimes it's hard to see where the bones come together. So anyway, those are some of the bones that we're going to be looking at. Okay, good. All right, so let's take a look at some of those. Third term for today is the term temporal. Just going to show you a few more things, then we're going to finish up. T-E-M-P-O-R-A-L. All right, so here's that occipital bone that I was talking about. You can see the mastoid processes of the temporal bone, which I showed you. The parietal bones you can see come together to form the superior part of the back of the skull, the posterior aspect, and the occipital bone is sort of the middle and the inferior aspect of it. Here we see the bones again. Here's the sphenoid, which you kind of see squeezed in there, which I didn't mention when we looked before. Again, here's the temporal bone. Here's the zygomatic arch of the temporal bone, or zygomatic process, sorry. The zygomatic arch too. The zygomatic bone is here, lacrimal, ethmoid, maxilla, nasal, frontal, parietal, occipital. Go through this, you're going to start to get a good feel for it. Here are the sinuses. We'll talk about the sinuses next time. But here's the sphenoid bone. You can see how it touches every single bone of the skull somehow, some way. Here's the ethmoid bone. You can see how the ethmoid bone actually comes up to the inferior aspect of the cranium, forms that perpendicular plate. Forms a perpendicular plate. Here's the maxilla. You can see here. Here's where I was saying the maxilla forms the anterior 2/3 of the hard palate. Here's the palatine bone, which makes up the posterior. Sphenoid goes all the way down here. Temporal. Here's the parietal. Here's the occipital. Here's the frontal, and then here's the mandible. Inferior view of the skull. Here's the maxilla, like I said before. Palatine bones here, the vomer right here, sphenoid right through here, temporal and occipital, foramen magnum, and then the occipital condyles. Here's that lesser wing of the sphenoid that I was talking about before. Easier to see here than on the skull itself. And here's the greater wing of the sphenoid. See the ethmoid bone pokes up through here, and there's holes in this. This is called the cribriform plate. These little holes are where the nerve endings for your olfactory nerve drop down so that you can get your sense of smell. Temporal bones, occipital, parietal. You'll see that this stuff, as you go through them and you work to memorize them, it'll get better and better for you. There's one bone that does not articulate with any other bone of the skeleton. This is called the hyoid bone, and the hyoid bone rests right here in the region of the neck, and the hyoid is kind of suspended by muscles. So, like the muscles you use to swallow, to move your tongue, some of those are attached and anchored to the hyoid bone. All right, so that's where we're going to stop. This is where I usually stop when we get together and we go through this. So we'll come back to this next time. Just want to go through a few things with you. Let me actually want to grab the PowerPoint and do that. Okay, let's. All right, so we got a clean slate here. Let me open this up. Okay, so what are some of the functions of bones? Going back to the beginning, what are some functions of bones?
Support.
Okay. Support, what else?
Protection.
Protection, yep. Yep.
Stores minerals.
Hematopoiesis. Storage of what?
Minerals.
Yep. So what was that?
Allow movement.
Allows for movement, yep. Any others?
Yeah, produces hormones.
It produces hormones, all right? Great, okay. What are the two different types of ossification?
The intramembranous.
Good, membranous. It's a long word. Okay, intramembranous. So describe it to me in your own words. What's happening?
It's basically last this
Yep, so the cells of the mesenchyme, which is the membrane, and embryonic membrane, cells of the mesenchyme differentiate, that's the fancy word, differentiate osteo what?
Blast.
Got it, osteoblasts. So they set up an ossification center. Have an ossification center, and they start secreting what? Bone what?
Matrix.
So then it secretes bone matrix, and what happens to the bone matrix?
Yeah.
Hardens. And then what are we left with? Osteocyte, right. And if we're in the compact bone, the osteocyte lives in what? What's the name of that pocket that it lives in?
And
Yep, lacuna. It helps you, I know, think of the Lion King. Like instead of Hakuna Matata, you can think of Lacuna Matata, all right? Whatever works. You'll never miss that. So lacuna, okay? Great. Okay, so that's one type of ossification. What's the other type of ossification?
The endochondral.
Yes, the endochondral. And tell me what that's about. Start with, when does this happen? Chondrome. Cartilage, right, so we begin with a cartilage what? Cartilage model, right? Then what happens? What happens? You're right, cartilage calcifies. It forms a what? Yeah, the medullary cavity. What kind of center is that? A blank center. Bone production center. Starts with an O.
The os-
Got it, ossification center. Okay, we also get the bony collar that forms, right, around the outside too? Hot dog doesn't have a little mustard. It's fine. All right. So then we get the primary ossification center, right? Primary ossification center here in the center. But then what do we get forming here? What do we call those? Secondary ossification centers, right? Side and this side. Okay? So we got the primary and secondary ossification centers, and then we start to see that this becomes bony, this is bony, this is bony, but then we have these lines here that are cartilaginous. What are those lines called? Epiphyseal, come on. Dead spots on this board. Also commonly known as what? So what's happening at the growth plate? Who can describe to me what happens, in your own words, what's happening at the growth plate? Yeah, so we have a resting center, right? The cartilage is doing nothing, right? Then below that we have what? Area where the cartilage is undergoing mitosis, right? And we have more cartilage cells. What's that center called? Growing, I should say, in number of cells. Remember what it's called? There's the P center. Proliferation center. And then what's next? What do the cells do? They get what? They expand, they get larger, hypertrophy, so the hypertrophic center, right? Hypertrophic center, and then below that we have the what? I don't know if it's the actual technical term, but it calcifies. It's like the calcification center. So this is the growth plate. The cartilage is just resting, and it proliferates, mitosis, growing a number of cells, mitosis, and the cells get larger, and then they calcify. Got it? Pushing this whole thing up. Epiphysis away from epiphysis. Couple more things. What are the different types of bone tissue? Two different types. Spongy is one, yeah. So we have the little threads of bone arranged in random order. What are those bony strings called? Starts with the T. Yeah, you got it. Trabeculae. Okay. Yeah. And then what's the other type? Compact. That grows in rings, right? Okay. What's the name for this unit right here? Close. Osteon, or reversion system. And what's this middle thing called? Reversion canal? Or the central canal? Yeah, different types of bone. We have spongy bone, we have compact bone, different types of bone. We have the circumferential lamella, remember? And then that's where we have the lacuna, right? Where the osteocytes live. And we have those little cracks and canals. Remember what those are called? Kind of sounds like canal. Yeah, close. The canaliculi. Okay, canaliculi. Good. Thought there was one more thing I wanted to over. What are the different types of bone marrow? Yellow and red. Red is where you see what happened. Formation of blood, and yellow is fat storage. What do you see? Where do you see? What do you see in adults versus children?
The fat marrow
Yep, the yellow is an adult,
and the red is.
red is in children. All right, and go over the stage of the fracture. We just went through that, so we went through that. What I would recommend, I know we're getting to the end here, so I don't want to keep you beyond our time. What I recommend is I provided you on Blackboard with a bone list. So make sure that you look at this bone list as you're going through and learning the bones. It will tell you, for example, how many of each bone there are. So we have the frontal, there's only 1, 2 parietal, and so forth. But I do have some bone markings on here too. So these are the bone markings that that you should be familiar with as you're going through. But every single bone of the body is located on this bone list. So if you're looking for a nice comprehensive list of the bones and how many, and just some characteristics of the different bones, like keystone of the face, for example, I have all that here. It's a nice list for you. We'll come back next time and work on it, but what I recommend you do, remember, every 24 hours that goes by that you don't review this stuff, it gets it gets forgotten. So make sure that within 24 hours, you're going through this again, especially the bones of the skull. Go through them again at least once within the next day or so. It'll stick better, okay? So keep working. That's one of the key areas, bones of the skull. Work on the bones of the skull, and get familiar with those. And what I recommend is just go through those bones of the skull until it becomes old hat and you're getting sick of it. You're like, yeah. Frontal, yeah, occipital, until it gets to be like almost a bore. That's where you want to get to, okay? So concentrate on that for next week. Next week, when we get together, we'll finish up the axial skeleton, move to the appendicular, and then we'll move on and cover the joints. Have a good one. Thank you very much.